this is what I call the roadmap, to the creative roadmap, okay? Hard to believe that I are an art teacher, eh? As you look at things like this. Okay, so here's this little roadmap, and this is what it actually looks like. I remember when I read this book and I came across this little drawing here, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this guy got it. This really is what this is like. And so what you see here is the search. Now, what do we mean by the search? Well, the search is when we're searching for something new. We're searching for a new direction. We're searching for something. Now, the thing is, what most of us do when we're searching for this thing, we tend to want to do something that in creativity we call the carryover syndrome. What we want to do is we want to do what we've done before because it worked before, okay? But understand this, if you continue to do what you've always done, you're going to wind up with where you've always been. You're never going to come into something new if you do that. So this is this map. So we're searching along this thing. And eventually, if we just keep on doing what we've always done, we're always going to wind up in a dead end someplace. It isn't going to produce a whole lot. Can we get new ideas going this way? Well, it is possible, but we're going to get lost in the woods around there, and maybe someday we can find a new solution. But normally, if we just keep on doing it, you're not going to get it. Okay, but what we do need is we need this thing that we call a lucky porthole. A lucky porthole. Now, this lucky porthole is something that comes along that perhaps we didn't expect. We can't control it. It comes out of the blue usually. But when you get this thing, it's this porthole, all of a sudden, there's this moment of an insight. You get this lucky thing, and it leads to an insight, what I call the insight plateau. And then with that insight, that's going to begin to shift your directions, and the next thing you know, you're going to be moving into the creative solution, which is going to give you a new direction. Okay, so here's how this thing works. Now, what I would like to do next is I'd like to take you through 2 breakthrough things that I had in my life to kind of illustrate this point. Okay, 2 breakthroughs. So as we look at these things, and there is an early work of mine right there. I'm a potter by profession, and at a later date, I'm going to talk about style. I'm going to talk about a little bit the development of how a person comes up with ideas for their style. But at this point in time, God had touched my heart. I was going to be a potter. I was going to be a functional potter, but I lost interest in that. And then all of a sudden, I wanted to start. There came a time when I realized the only thing I wanted to do was tell stories about Jesus. I wanted to be a storyteller in clay. And so I began to make these images. And at the time, I was telling these stories here, and like this is the back part of a pot. This is the betrayal and the denial of Jesus. And so I was making these large forms. I was putting these colors on there. And on one side, I have the Judas kissing Jesus, and here I have the 3 disciples kind of going in the background. Now, this is an old piece. This is 1970-something vintage, okay? One day, I was doing another Gethsemane piece like this, and I had made this form, and so now I had drawn these woods in the back, and as I was carving out what's called a sunken relief carving in the background between the branches of the trees, I had underestimated the thinness of the vessel, and I accidentally penetrated the vessel and I broke through. Well, as soon as that happened, I got really ticked off at myself because I thought I'd ruined it. But I thought to myself, well, I've already done it. I wonder what happens if I'd cut out all these things. So I began to cut out all these little branches in between and get that's called negative space. And I was making these things. Now, as I'm doing that, I was kind of enamored by the darkness of that space. And I said, wow, that's kind of sharp. That's like a real dark kind of graphite in a drawing. And I kind of liked this. But my problem was, because I'd never done this before, I didn't know what was going to happen to the clay. Because in clay, you're going to put it in a kiln. And at this time, I was firing my work to 2,400 degrees as a stoneware temperature. And I wasn't sure, because what happens is clay, when it gets fired to a really high temperature, will often return to its soft plastic state. When I'm carving into these things, it's at a leather hard state, where it feels kind of like hard cheese. Okay, and I'm carving through these things. So I didn't know what's going to happen when this goes soft again. Will all that collapse in? I'd already messed it up, so I figured I had nothing to lose. So I started to carve those things in. Now, in carving those things in to make that wooded scene, I had an aha moment. I wasn't looking for this, but I had an aha. It's the lucky insight. What was the insight? As I began to do this, I began to think all of a sudden of stained glass windows. You know the tracery, you have the tracery of the stained glass, and you have the glass in between, and it reminded me of stained glass windows. Now, I knew something about art history because I taught it. And what I know is this. When they made the Gothic cathedrals with the stained glass windows, they just didn't do that because somebody thought it would be a good idea. What they were doing is they were trying to let light into the church. And up until there was this kind of apocryphal gospel that was going around that said God is light, but they interpreted it as literally light. And in the Middle Ages, they believed if you wanted to have God in a sacred space, you had to fill the space with light. And so because of that, they had to find a way to let light in. Well, they didn't know how to do this, but they decided to make a building where the walls would be nothing but light, but they didn't have the ability to manufacture big panes of glass. So they made these little traceries. They filled them with stained glass. But the idea was, let's let sacred light in to illuminate the sacred space because God is in the light, so they believed. So that's the genesis for starting to build these Gothic cathedrals. Now, I know that's why they did this. As I'm cutting this, I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this is kind of like stained glass windows. And in that moment, I got this idea, well, wait a minute. In the Gothic cathedrals, you're letting sacred light in. What would happen if I made pots and I used the same principle of light, but instead, I believe that the sacred light is in us. And I want to do is I want to let the light out. After I had that insight, and I got excited about this, this was the first piece that I made after I had that insight. And so what you can see is there's a picture. And by the way, I was very excited about this. It might not seem like much to you, but I was really excited. So it's kind of an autobiographical piece. That's me. I was sitting, I was a lot thinner then. I'm sitting on a stool, and I'm in the temple of God. You can see there's kind of a Greek temple. And along the side there, I have vines growing up. In those days, I was using the cloud as a symbol for God because when I looked across through the Old and New Testament, God seemed to show up in the clouds, in Mount Sinai. We find the cloud there in the Transfiguration. Jesus is going to return in the clouds. So I began to use that cloud as just a symbol for the presence of God. And then I put these little spiral things up there. And the most ancient symbol of the Holy Spirit is not a dove, it's a spiral. And so I began to use this kind of very hidden symbol of a spiral in there. And that's me sitting in the temple of God, worshiping God, thanking God, as it were, for the breakthrough that I had of using this idea. These are meant to be luminaries that have light inside that let the sacred light out. Now, what this did is it led to a style of pottery that nobody else was doing. Now, it's not like no one had ever made luminaries before, little candle holders, but I had not seen anything like this, and to this day, I don't know of anybody that's seen anything like it, nor have I met another artist who's seen other people.